And welcome to the Blackhouse. We're in the house today with Octavius. How are you?
Hey, doing good. Happy Saturday, everybody.
All recovering from Cuba and Sascha.
Yes, hi, hello. I'm ready for the midterm break.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, you guys have been flat. You guys basically, we've got Mia behind the camera here. You can like wave, hey, hey.
Hi, guys.
We've got, you guys have practically been living in the library, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I stay there probably until like 10 p.m. most days of the week.
And what time do you get there in the morning?
Anywhere from like 9 to 11. So
Yeah.
It's a full day.
Yeah.
A full day.
Yeah, I think that everything should start at 11. Because that's the only time that I'm kind of like, my eyes are starting to open.
I agree.
And then it's like, oh my God, it's another day.
Yeah.
Anyway, our topic today, we're going to be talking about consent.
Yes.
What does that mean? And I guess in there we're going to talk a little bit about boundaries, yeah?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I think they go hand in hand with each other.
Yeah. I'm learning about boundaries for myself. Like, I've been boundaryless most of my life. And now I feel like I'm standing at my boundaries, fully armed. Don't cross. I may shoot. That's what I feel like. Like I'm on the front line. Like, don't cross my boundary. I'm protecting the space. Anyway, can you start us off, Octavius, with a bit about consent? Because you did this really, this is really good.
Yeah, so we were talking about just subjects that we could talk about on radio, and consent came up. And it's a huge topic right now from... if you're talking about Dave Chappelle and a lot of other comedians, and cancel culture and what is and can't be said anymore.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of their commentary for comics is around that, relationships, how we're navigating, talking with, and the boundaries that we have with each other.
Yeah.
So this issue of consent is huge for many of us at uni. It's an ongoing conversation now too, but it's that thing too where we often see it in the public forums of social media, of institutions like the university, but is that permeating into our private conversations, into our actual relationships? And so that's what we want to get into. Yeah. We know, and we're giving these definitions from sexual prevention organizations and a lot of campaigns, but how is that language, how are those practices actually influencing how we're individually treating each other?
Yeah.
Now, that could be your sexual partner, that can be how you negotiate in your relationship with your parent, with your coworkers, with your flatmates.
Yeah.
Consent and flatmates is a huge thing here. And I'm learning, yes, because there's really different cultures about, what you are allowed to do, have, touch,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I just find that the whole thing, because, coming from an older generation, it's all like, I don't know what to say now or how to say it or if I've said the wrong thing. And then, of course, you get the typical thing of our generation. It's like, well, if everything, we don't give a damn. You know what I mean? But it's like, it's such a weird thing because even as you get older, I'm noticing there's issues with consent and boundaries for older women.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not dealing with the same things that young people are dealing with, but it's a whole new set of stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. So continue.
Yeah, and that's one thing too as well, that our conversation, or what I wanted us to engage with, is not just how to blame people and how to cancel people, or and find out who's the worst person that never gives consent or not, but it is to say that this is an ongoing conversation, and it's a learning for all of us, myself included. And part of what I shared with the group privately, but I also share when I teach, is my journey. That I don't come to a discussion around consent saying I've always done it perfectly. I have had to navigate and understand and listen to other people, that even my understandings of what is right or not, how to negotiate or ask for consent, doesn't always line up with other people, and I need to be open to hearing them and understanding. And ideally, those individuals also need to be open for me learning the process, because there's always that thing too of hearing that something's right or wrong, and then actually being able to do it yourself. And often that takes a little bit of time, especially if you're older.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, we're like, you get kind of, it's like we're dealing with another type of people sometimes. Like, because not like an alien.
No, but I know what you mean. Yeah, but some people treat it like that.
Yeah.
And what I've seen too in terms of looking at history is this conversation continues to happen. So
Yeah.
people in the 70s said it to, their parents and grandparents from the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
And then previous to that too.
Yeah.
Many of us who come from different countries, when you move to it's a whole new conversation around consent now.
I
Yeah.
think it's because,
yeah.
sorry, I think it's because it gets redefined every time. Because we know more and now we learning more about what is morally correct and what's not. And, that might be different in the 70s and the 80s compared to today's world.
Yeah.
So let's start off with in getting everyone's
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah.
With, when did you first learn about or hear about consent?
I probably first learned about consent in early high school, and it was in a very formal and academic way, and it was very much focused around relationships and sexual relationships. And I don't think it was until a couple years ago, I think when I was either 2021, when I realized one, consent and boundaries go hand in hand, and those can be applied to all of my relationships. It doesn't just have to be the person that I'm in a romantic relationship with. And I think it's a learning process for sure. And again, my experience of interacting with someone like my mom who is 64 is sometimes a very frustrating situation because I'll be like, hey, I would like this boundary. And then in her mind, that comes off as maybe a judgment of her own character, or that she's not, a perfect person. And I'm not a perfect person either, but yeah.
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 I love that you brought that in, so that it was taught to you, and even for myself in the research I was done, it's always about your sexual partner.
Yeah.
But then you brought up your relationship with your mother.
Right.
Because that also brings in the issue not just of consent, but of power dynamics.
Power dynamics.
And cultural dynamics too. What
Yeah.
does respect for your elders or your parents look like in the conversation? How do you
Right.
navigate that with consent?
Yeah, I agree completely, and I feel also there's a question of or at least in my own family, is love able to sort of conquer, overpower certain relationship dynamics that might not necessarily be super healthy, or sort of an idea at the end of the day we all love each other, so even if our communication isn't 100%, we still love each other at the end of the day.
Oh yes, I've heard that too.
Yeah.
It's really funny, because my first understanding of consent was just contracts.
Okay.
Yeah.
You give consent, you sign your name, it's a contract. I didn't know about consent in relationships until I was well into my 40s. That conversation never happened. It was more about the conversations we were having were more about boundaries, maybe, but not about this whole thing around consent and love relationships or consent and stuff. And I actually learnt that very late in life.
And that's also intriguing too, because from my religious background, they would often marry the two. So they would take what you got from your work or, that life and a contract of consent and put that or overlay that same contract format on a wedding or a marriage.
Yeah.
And so I heard about that your vows
Yeah.
and this contract that you made with God and your partner, that was your consent. So
Yeah.
you consented to submitting to your husband.
Yeah.
You consented to whatever demands
Yeah.
that he made. And that was it. You
Yeah.
signed a contract when there was a ring and in front of everybody.
Yeah.
And that's how many women and men viewed, in terms of relationships.
Yeah, because I'm not a big fan of marriage and all that sort of stuff. In the sense that I think that it's an important. I personally don't think it's an important part of a relationship because we have those we can have de facto relationships, right? And I always thought, I don't know if I ever want to sign a contract that says I have to submit to this dude that I might be interested in, which goes against a lot of cultural beliefs.
Yeah.
Right? The first thing that I was ever asked when I went to Tanzania is, because I have kids, where's the husband? I said, like, why do I need a husband? I don't need a...
It's
You know, like
funny
that.
to say that, like, the
Yeah.
single mother population is not as huge as it is in Tanzania. It's crazy that they even asked that, because, like, it's such a common thing.
Yeah.
At least in a lot of black communities, but in Tanzanian communities, it's very, very rare for dads to stay. And if they do stay, there's always, like, some underlying issue, but that's
Really? Wow.
But yeah.
So, you know, like, when you've grown up in an environment where most of the people have not made these formal contracts as marriage and consented, that kind of becomes the norm. And that was my environment growing up. Like, most of the women that I knew were not married. They were actually in long-term de facto relationships that, for, you know, if they weren't getting beaten up, then basically that was considered a good relationship.
Yeah.
And never mind any of the other emotional stuff that could have been going on there.
Yeah.
You know, and there can be a lot of stuff that you don't consent to emotionally, right, in a relationship. And I think that's the new thing is that I'm learning as an adult is what do I consent to as an older person, an older woman, from an emotional thing, not physical, not marriage, not what do I consent to?
Wow.
And that gets breached so many times. Yeah.
Can you give an example of what you mean?
Gaslighting.
Okay. Yep.
Gaslighting. Gaslighting is probably something I experienced more than anything else. Is denying your own reality of what's actually going on, being not your word not being taken seriously.
Yes.
Also, I guess another thing is I think is the assumption that if you've had children, you're everybody's mother and that's what you want to be.
Yeah.
Ooh.
And I'm like, yeah, I raised my two boys. I spent 36 years, you know, letting them mess my life up. And now I'm free. And it's kind of like, I'm enjoying my freedom. Well, just let me enjoy my freedom. I don't want any more kids. And when I do want to have more kids around me, let that be my choice. Don't impose that on me.
Wow.
So
that's huge.
I think that one of the things like I first noticed when I came back to New Zealand was this attitude because you wanted to go out. Like, out is not a place for you. You're supposed to be home with your kids.
Yeah.
My kids are growing up.
Are your
Don't tell me.
grandkids?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a grandma yet.
I know, right? But I mean, like, that's
Yeah.
how they regulate you as you move
Yeah.
up. If it's not your kids and you raise them, well, you're supposed to take care of someone else's kids.
Yeah, and I find it's really weird because I never sort of noticed that, like in the 90s when I was like in my 20s and 30s, right? And you're in town and I'd see like some of the younger kids and they'd be like, hey auntie, we'll see you at the club, we'll see you at our club. No, it's our club. You're now coming to our club, right? So that wasn't an issue. And even me with older people, I never had that. But now there seems to be this reverse ageism. I don't know if, like, what are those old people doing now? You know? And I'm like, this is so damaging for some people's emotional health and well-being, you know? Like, I really wish that more older women, especially African women, now listen to this, this is a PSA.
Yeah. Let it out.
The PSA is, I want to see more older women getting out and enjoying themselves, whatever their ethnicity is, you know, because we haven't figured out what's going to be here for us as older people. That hasn't been figured out. There isn't anything. And if we don't make our own happiness, whether it's like, you want to go out and party, go out and party. If you want to go to the church, go to the church. You want to go to the mosque, go to the mosque. Fine. Whatever your thing is, go out and do it. Because if you don't, that's the stuff that's going to hurt you later on. You know what I mean? It's like you're going to start feeling isolated and we're already marginalised, you know. It's just going to marginalise us more. And, you know, this is... just enjoy your lives and leave us alone to enjoy our lives. And I guess that's the consent boundary thing where, you know, you always get these creepy bloody uncles. They want to come up and like have something to say about it.
You know what's interesting is that my first encounter with, or like the first time I was taught about consent, it was more like they already predetermined what I'm supposed to say. So they were immediately like, oh yeah, relationships, everything, no. This, no, but you have to listen to everything that your adults say. So I had a rubric of this is what you're supposed to do. So I wasn't really given the space to say yes or no. I wasn't given the space to have boundaries. And I think this translates into what you're saying, that when you're older now, everyone has a say on what you have to do, how you have to conduct yourself, because again, you grow up with this rubric of things that you have to say yes or no to, and so you never recognize that you actually have the power to say no when you need to, or yes when you want to.
And if you don't follow, and I think the other thing in that is that if you don't follow the rubric, bad things can happen to you. And when bad things happen to you, it's your fault.
Thank you.
Exactly. And if they do end up happening, everyone just blames you. As if like you didn't follow the rule book, so of course this was going to happen. And it's not like it happens 100% of the time. That's, you know, bad situations happen because bad situations just happen. You can't, and then people grow up with the trauma of like, if I don't listen, if I don't conform, if I don't follow what they're telling me, I am never gonna, like, you know. It's such a...
I think Wellington also has always been a place where it's a very conservative town in comparison to like places I've lived. Even Perth, as remote as Perth is in Australia, Wellington is way more conservative than Perth. And Perth is probably the most country town you can go to in Australia, right? So, like New Zealand is just very conservative. And it's also really small. So it was always this thing of feeling like you're being monitored. You know, like you're always being watched, and I've often heard from, you know, like women I know in the African community where they feel like other community members are watching them and that will comment on them and that will, you know, and so they don't want to be seen to be. And, you know, I kind of go, well, you know, for me, I'm New Zealand, African New Zealand, and I feel that. And I'm thinking, why should I feel that? You know, like... And it took me a while to grow out of it, but I was very susceptible, very vulnerable to that when I was a lot younger. But after 10 years in Australia, where it's much more, it's less conservative, and there's more spaces for you to actually be who you are. That was actually a bit of a salve, if you know what I mean. Like, like as badly, you know, full-on, overtly racist as Australia is, it's got spaces that New Zealand doesn't have yet. And especially small-town New Zealand like Wellington, because Wellington's just a village, really, in my opinion. You know, you can't do anything in Wellington without somebody hearing about it. You don't think you can cheat on your missus or cheat on your man in Wellington and people won't know about it. They will know about it. They will see you somewhere, you know.
I think it's a very big trend in the Black community also to like watch each other and what we're doing and like keeping people in check in a way. It's like, oh, she needs to be like this or she needs to be like that. And again, it's just projection from how we're raised and what we're told we can or cannot do. And like, these is our boundaries to our personalities, these are boundaries to this and this and this. And it's such a big trend in the Black community, I'd say.
Very big trend.
Yeah, and you see it in all communities too. So I often have talked with and read from or listened to white women, and they say all the things that you may critique about us, how we keep our hair, how we talk, how we present ourselves, how strict we are with our weight. That's because our community is policing our bodies in terms of men. And growing up as a man and trying to figure out what that means. And do I even get a right to have consent as a man? You know, everyone who's touched my body, I'm supposed to be grateful for. You know, it's supposed to up my masculinity, up my self-worth, even when I don't want to be touched. You know, even if the person is attractive. You know, so it's those two, these different degrees of, and again, how your gender factors in, how your sexuality. And again, in the queer community, it's a huge issue of consent as well, where we talk all about it, straight people touching us or whining us or, you know, fondling us, but what about when it's in our own communities? And what I can hear, you know, in our discussion and what we've had, or I've had privately too, is the issue that consent often gets relegated to private conversations, especially if you're in a marginalized or in group. And why? Because you don't want to feed the stereotypes and perpetuate, you know, violences or mischaracterizations of your culture, whether it's Tanzania, of your gender, whether it's male. And that leads to a lot of this too, where we're each coming from and saying, you know, in different degrees, but to the same core, that we've been taught by someone those lessons, those rule books on
Mm.
consent, some of them we don't agree with, some of them we don't understand or know where they come from, and we're left then to just navigate. Because there is no overarching universal golden rule about consent. What we said is it is contextual, it is based on your cultural, it is based on, you know, the country that you live in, whether it's Perth or Wellington.
Yeah.
So knowing and living in that, how are you individually navigating, you know, and making sure that you not only keep yourself safe, because I know a lot of the conversation has been focused on safety, but what about the joy of connection and relationship? So how do you make consent not just as a rule, you know, or policing of your interaction, but a way to like actually, you know what, if we respect and understand the definitions of consent between us, we can have a much richer relationship. Whether that's a friendship, a sexual one, you know, going out clubbing with, you know, other girls.
Going out dancing.
Yeah. I think, at least for me, a big part of it is just navigating and finding relationships where instead of feeling like I'm drained and exhausted from seeing someone, I actually feel really, really nourished. And I feel like, especially since I've moved to Wellington, that's been my like main focus in all of my relationships, to sort of figure out like, okay, is this person respecting the boundaries that I'm sort of setting, and they're making me feel like I can walk away and go about my day, or am I walking away and I feel exhausted because there aren't really any boundaries in the relationship, or the way that we're communicating is creating a situation, where there aren't any boundaries.
And how do you set those boundaries? Verbally, non-verbally, or?
I feel it depends. I think it's like super contextual, because if there is conflict, then I know that I'm definitely someone to just sort of say up front, like, hey, I'm setting a boundary, this thing really upset me, I would like this to not happen again. But again, like, that can upset some people, because then they'll feel like, you know, they're a bad person. And I guess, like, non-verbally, I feel like I'm just, like, firm about what my schedule is, I guess. Like, if I, for example, like, have to get a bunch of work done, but there are people hanging out in an area of the library, I might just have to go, like, MIA for a little while and get my work done. And that's what I'll have to do.
It's so different when it comes to like consent between friends and consent between relationships, because with relationships I feel like, at least in my perspective, it's a bit easier to set boundaries, like, hey, I don't like you doing this, or hey, I don't like you communicating with me in this way. But when it comes to friendships, especially if you've like gotten really close to someone, it's really hard to tell them like, no, I don't like it when you do this, or I don't want to spend this much time with you in the week, I get exhausted, and they take it personally, like, oh, you don't like me. It's like a hit to their ego, and it's like, no, I value this so much, that's why I'm telling you I don't want to resent you. And so that's why I'm setting this boundary with you. It's from a place of love, and not a place from I hate you and go away, you know? It's so, it's different. I find it way easier in relationships to just tell people, I don't want to do this, or this is not how I want to conduct myself, than tell friends.
And I feel like a part of that, or at least what I think a part of that is because I think from a very, very like early age, people are always told that romantic relationships are the most important relationships in your life, or the most important relationships that you should like strive to have. And so then there's very little emphasis on forging healthy friendships, and your friends are just kind of like on the sidelines while your romantic relationship is maybe in the middle of your life. Or that's at least in my mind how I feel like I was sort of like raised to perceive romantic versus friendships.
And look at all the movies that we watch about that too, where a man or a woman, you throw away your friends, or they understand that they're relegated because they were just a placeholder.
Right.
You know, and that's how many people treat friendship. You're a placeholder until I get my good job. You're a placeholder until I get my good man or my good woman. You're a placeholder until I get my pet. You know.
And then there's the flip side, when you've been through the relationship dramas and whatnot, where your friends become more important than the relationship. Like, I think I'm at that point now. I like my friends, but I've had to learn to have boundaries, because I think when I first moved into an African community in Wellington, I was so excited just to be in an African community. I didn't care who you were. I'm just so excited to be around other black people. Like, that's what I wanted to be around. Because I'd spent all my time with Pacific Island and Māori people. So, you know, and I really wanted to be around my own people after I got back from Tanzania. I was just like, say to my sister in Taranaki, now I'm done with this, sis. I need to be around black people the same way you need to be around Māori people, you know? And so, like, I didn't have any boundaries. I didn't have any filter. There wasn't any filter. There'd been no filter developed. So that took a while. And I think I only came into my understanding of that in Australia when you're living in a situation where you don't have the same safety nets that you have in New Zealand, right? You're there working, paying tax. If you can't work, you can't pay tax. You can't pay tax, you can't live there, right? It's pretty tough for Kiwis over there.
Yeah.
So I had to harden up because I had to keep working and I had to keep going into situations where they would be toxic situations, work situations, right? And so I had to learn what my boundaries were around certain people. And I learned that I have a very low tolerance and can tell a supervisor off like he's my kid if he wants to act that way. Like, bring that tone. You know what I mean? I'm kind of like, do I look like one of your little friends? No, I'm not. So I learned that actually in the toxic working environments that I was in. And I lost a few jobs over that, you know, like, and it wasn't because I couldn't do my job. It was because I wasn't taking their attitude. Right? Like, I wasn't going to take their stuff. And I think the same thing can play out in relationships where, you know, the amount of narcissism that's just rampant everywhere. If you don't play the game, they can come back at you quite nastily. You know what I mean?
Well, especially if you're in like a gaslighting situation, I feel like it's even hard to know whether or not you are even in the wrong or if the other person is doing something that's not good. And
it's like your emotional ties to that person that tells you, and I've sort of like, no, you know, like, I know what my reality is. This is my reality. You're not going to gaslight me into thinking it's something else or creating an ulterior narrative. Like, I'm quite good, but what I do still find, I get triggered by it. And so I tend to avoid people like that now because my triggeration is like, I can go from 0 to 100, so, you know, I don't like to be in that situation. So it's better for me just to avoid people like that because that doesn't bring me any, that makes me feel drained. I feel drained after that. I feel tired, you know.
And from what, you know, Liya and Sascha, I both heard you say is talking about how, you know, understanding your own comfortability with consent, with boundaries particularly. It's not just about policing the other person, but it's about protecting your own mental and emotional well-being and health. Which makes you then a good person for all the other people in your life and that you're connected with.
Because that consent and boundary is so important to your own mental health and well-being. Because if you don't know your boundaries, or when you're not giving consent, if you don't know that, that's when those lines get exploited, I think.
So if for all those listening, I do want you to at least take the one nugget, if you do take one, is that consent is an ongoing conversation. And that you get to define, especially for yourself and your own well-being, how you navigate that, what language or how do you want to communicate that as well. Because that has been one of the issues, especially that I hear from adults and adult learners in this space of consent, is that they get tired or they get to everything. It's the amount of work or effort it takes to engage with and say, do I really have to ask every partner? Do I really have to ask, even if it was just someone at the club and, you know, we just were having drinks, I really need to ask for a kiss now or to hold their hand. I really need to ask my child.
I think it's because we have this illusion from movies that it happens so, like, smoothly.
Perfectly, right? A Disney finish, you know, everything. We're all beautiful, loving each other.
He's just going to hold my hand and he's going to be the most loving person ever. And it's like, okay, not everyone who's going to try to touch your body is going to be the nicest person ever. Like, let's just get that out of the way.
And even if that person you do love and they're perfect and, you know, you're Prince Charming or you're beautiful queen, you know, or you're beautiful drag queen, right, that you love. Them touching you in this moment or this day or this year may not be true 5 years from now. It may not be true during COVID, where, you know, all of us took a hit up, for many of us took a hit on our mental health. We're like, actually, no, I don't want to be touched right now. I'm stressed. I think you might got the COVID food.
Like, you know, taking from that, COVID is actually an interesting time with the consent conversation coming up, because a lot of people are now starting to have a scarcity mindset and therefore compromising their boundary and feeling more obligated to say yes to everything, because they're like, when is this chance going to come around again? AKA, this can be like jobs, this can be visiting family, it can even be like, let's say a Christmas that you don't want to attend, you're like, because there's Aunt Jemima who's annoying, who's like homophobic or something like that, and you're like, I don't want to be in that space with her. But then you're like, oh, when am I ever going to be able to sit in the room with grandma there, you know, present and alive, you know? So you get pressure to like, oh, I can't miss out on this, and so you're like, I'm just gonna compromise or put myself in a situation where I don't necessarily want to be in there, and I know I'm not gonna be comfortable, just because I have this mindset that this is never gonna present itself again.
Yeah. And we saw it coming out during COVID. The amount of queer people who said, well, I have to go back home. Or I have to, you know, queer or not, I have to stay in this relationship. Because there is no possibility of me finding a new apartment or flat. There is no, or finding and meeting, you know, another partner. And so it becomes that too, in terms of, there's these, again, with the cyclone that's happening. And so what if you're a climate refugee or something has happened in terms of an earthquake? How do you navigate, and is the society built to honor or even to see and negotiate what your consent levels are? And so that's why I also wanted to ask or take the conversation away, not away from, but to say yes as an individual one. And often too, we're asked to individually navigate, to come up with strategies, to figure this out. But the reality is that we do live in a culture and a society. And part of the responsibility of us being good citizens, of not killing each other and committing crimes, you know, that's part of our contract of citizenship, that we'll be good in good character. But part of what we then receive, you know, from the government or from the culture and society we live in is protections too, is honoring us as well. So I wanted to ask her, get your opinions on how do you feel New Zealand as a whole is holding up, is honoring or providing a space where you feel that your rights and your voice around consent is heard and honored?
That's
I don't, well, I
have to be honest.
I don't know. Hell no.
Yeah, be honest.
I mean, you know, what is it? You gave some stats in here, like 94% of people who are raped can't report it or don't report it.
Yes.
You know, and so clearly, if we have statistics like that, if we have statistics of domestic violence, if we have statistics of, you know, struggling mental health issues because you're living in toxic situations, they're not. They're not doing it. It's not being taken seriously. To me, it was like, you know, I can give you an example, like every mine site I worked at had a code of conduct that they have on the wall that they expect everybody to follow. Nobody followed any of it. I mean, I left one mine site because of the racial abuse, right? And I was able to get something out of that because lawyers in Perth weren't challenging mine companies, even though I went to the mining company and I had, you know, documentation. But the fact that the guy that was in charge of the mine site, who was also African, he was the mine manager, said, well, what do you expect me to do about it? I'm dealing with the same type of thing in the level that I'm working at. So I was an operator and he was in management. And I just said, well, you make sure I get all those free training certificates. You just make sure I get them sent to me. Like, because otherwise you leave a mine site, they keep all your training and you have to buy your training again. So you might already know how to drive machinery, but you've got to go and buy the mine keeps your training papers. So that's about $5,000 worth of papers, right? So basically I got him to send me that stuff because even though they weren't honouring their commitments, what they're saying, he was like, I'm in the same situation, so like, I'm going to help you out. You know what I mean? But if it wasn't him, that wouldn't have been the case, right? It wouldn't have been the case if he wasn't a Zimbabwean mine manager, right? It wouldn't have been like that. it would have been like, well, good luck, see you later, because that's how they are, you know. So it doesn't matter what. I just think we say a lot of stuff in New Zealand that we are creating these new policies and things, but in real life, that's not how it is at all. It's not how it operates.
And I think part of that is that it goes back to consent being a constant conversation, or like you can't have one conversation around consent and then everything is okay. Or even with the club that Mia and I run, I feel like one thing that we should be talking about more is that like consent, it should always be discussed, and we shouldn't just say at the beginning of the year like, oh, we're gonna be a safe space. We need to constantly be living up to that expectation that we are gonna be welcoming and safe. And
that's why I feel like a lot of conversations, at least at Vic, are very performative. And why I say that's a little bit of a hot take, because we just had sex week and there was a whole thing. But there's all these like conversations like, this is what consent is, and they give you like these little condoms and they're like, you need to first ask if someone's gonna be like, you know, and it's like, okay, I guess you're putting it out there and you're showing people, but what is actually being done? How are people, you're just telling people, oh, consent, you need to get consent. Most people don't even know what the definition of consent is. They just know say yes or no. And they don't realize that consent, tying it to just sexual or like romantic relationships, is taking away so much. Because then again, you have to have consent with, you know, your workspaces, you have to have consent with your friends, you have to have consent. Even like a lot of different scenarios in life, even what you eat, you give consent to what food you want to eat, you know? Like yes, I like beans, I wouldn't like broccoli, you know? It's stupid, but it's still, that's where, consent is such a broad thing, and now I'm so happy we're having a conversation and broadening out side relationships, because it's not just that.
Yeah, because like you said, workplaces, like, you know, do you consent to being treated a particular way? And if you're not giving consent, how is HR or management dealing with that issue? If you're not being consented to be called the N-word at work or anything, and you go to HR, are they dealing with it? No, they never deal with it.
And then that's when the power dynamics come in. And it's constantly like, oh, I don't want to say no to this person, or I don't want to put this boundary in place because I'm going to upset them. And then they're probably not going to like be a good reference for my next job if I want to leave. And now you're stuck in this job that you don't like because you don't want to upset someone who's going to affect your CV in some way. It's like
that was always an issue in Australia, that like I suddenly realised, like, for the first time, because I've been a single parent and, you know, in New Zealand, you know, since I was 21. So I always had that security of like, you know, you get the DPB, right? But in Australia, it really depended on that employer's attitude about whether you were going to keep the roof over your head or not. And we had that threatened more than once. And every time that happened, it was this massive like, okay, I have to find another job right now. I have to make sure that the rent's paid up for a few weeks because I don't know if I'm going to get another wage. I've got to, like, it was just like that. And we moved like 8 times in 10 years. I worked at 11 mine sites because, you know, I continually had these really young, narcissistic, awful managers that were like, you know, the same age as my kids. And like, you keep pushing the bear, you keep poking the bear, and you're going to get somebody's mum coming at you. That's what's going to happen. You know, I've made a couple of my supervisors cry because of that. But, you know, like, nah, and I'm going. Like, put me on the plane. Take me away. I don't even want to be here no more. But, you know, I was resilient enough to keep being able to get myself into an employment situation and get myself out of that. But the thing is that we shouldn't have to live like that. It shouldn't be happening in the first place. There should be somewhere, if they're really serious about the consent thing in New Zealand, then there should be a very serious place that you can actually go, like, this is what's going on, here's my documentation of it, blah, 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 what can I do about this?
And that's why you think, like, what has to happen until they start having these conversations? Because the only reason we're having consent, you know, conversations about consent around sexual relationships is because most of where like sexual violence happens is universities and like big student hubs and like clubs and things like that. That's why that's where the conversation stems from the most. So what has to happen in workplaces, friendships, like, you know, professional relationships until people start having these conversations?
And I feel like, again, part of it is that, or part of the reason why it is such a big conversation is because a very specific group, which, at least what I've observed, is that it is usually like young white women coming forward and talking about how they were abused or something happened to them that was non-consensual. But I mean, obviously, in so many places all over the world, like, if you want to just, like, talk about the entirety of the transatlantic slave trade, like, none of that was consensual.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
None of that was consensual.
Yeah.
But you touch on a factor that really is important, and it can cause controversy if people are coming to the conversation to make adversaries instead of listening with love. So when us as people of color, as Black people, as queer people, as women, or neurodiverse people, different abilities, when we say that there are particular people that are put up in our society and then within media and within our legal systems, and we're often talking about POC or white, individuals, whether male or female, straight or queer, right? They are often put at the forefront of what the public face of an issue is. What, Sascha is saying and connecting to is that if you look back at the history, though, of those who often fought for rights. So before white feminism was the thing, there was Black women talking about that.
Yeah.
That you're fighting for a job, but I'm your maid, and I didn't, and if I had a right for consent, I would be taking care of my children, not yours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and again, and I don't want POC or white people who listen to that to feel like that's an attack. It's not. But it's also to say, too, that, and I've had to learn this as a male, because for a long time I used to fight, well, I'm fat and I'm this and that and I'm short, so, I'm not attracted to certain women, or I'm not, and people have attacked my masculinity because how I sound, so I don't accept that, I can impede or be like a male figure in this consent thing too, like, I'm more on the women's side, like, I feel like that. And people are like, no, you may feel that way, and that's how you navigate some of your relationships and circumstances, but because of how you were born, the way society treats you, what you're protected from, that you're not even conscious about, those things are real. Even if you don't experience it and know it, if you don't have language for it, that does not mean it's not real. So what we're saying here too is we're not trying to invalidate the actual, horrors that do happen to white women and white men. We're not saying that or invalidating that or challenging that, but we are saying that our voices, our experiences, our issues around consent are just as equally important. And you really don't tackle consent issues or putting protections for people with privileges, whether that's male privilege, whether that's white privilege, whether that's, capital privilege of just growing up in a family or society that has money or access to resources. I lost my point, but just to say that those individuals in those communities, the way that you ensure that you're protected is by protecting those who are actually marginalized, who don't have a voice. Because when you can take and push, give rights to the people all the way in the back, that pushes forward. Pushes forward and covers everyone else. So you don't have these gaps. Because like we're saying, and like my research showed, that now in New Zealand law, consent still is ambiguous in its definition, and is often targeted as what consent is not. So, consent can be coercive, and everyone has mentioned or talked about that in some way. Coercion being a part of how they're navigating that. Are there consequences to me telling you how I honestly feel and what I want? And then are those consequences something I can navigate or accept, or will they really ruin my life? Ruin, my work possibilities and gaining employment? Will I be homeless? And in terms of, your parents and things like that, for a lot of queer people, where, you don't consent to being in the closet, but the reality is if you ever, the coercion is, well, you'll be kicked out of the family. You'll be excommunicated. We'll take away our love from you. In the religious sense, you might go to conversion therapy or some form of that. Now you're going to be outed in front of your church, and you might have demons and people are going to lay hands on you. Or again, as we see now within our younger communities and consent in social media, how a lot of people are taking the conversations or the issues of consent and taking it to a public form of social media as opposed to individuals. And I'm not one to say social media itself is a tool that's just inherently evil, but I do say that when unhealthy people use tools, those tools become unhealthy as well.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of that, how do all of us navigate, social media and these issues of consent too?
I feel like what my mind goes to is sort of the cancel culture that exists within social media. And I mean, I've definitely been in situations, my Instagram is public, and at one point I was in a situation where I was calling out this white business owner in my hometown because he had a shirt that was really classist, and it said something like gentrifiers rule or something, or like gentrifiers or like kicking like Portlanders out. It was something ridiculous like that. And so I really called him out, and I was tagging his business and everything. And I then also had a lot of conversations with my friends though around consent and whether or not it was okay to do that. In my mind, I feel like it's still a little controversial because at the end of the day, I know that this white man isn't really going to be canceled. His business is going to be fine. He's going to get customers. That city has an incredible tourism industry. He'll be okay. But it would have been nice if through that action he could have apologized a little bit.
Yeah.
Or not made money off of selling those shirts also because he was selling the shirts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
More
That's
context.
different.
Yeah.
I think the similar things come up in New Zealand with the gollywogs. Gollywog dolls. You know the gollywog dolls?
I might have taken a picture
Yeah.
of one of them at an op shop. So please tell me though, so I can make sure I'm not.
Yeah, like there was a bit of a sort of thing on social media about the gollywog. Yeah, and because the gollywog doll was quite popular down here. I personally have never liked gollywog dolls. But the people who have an opinion on whether gollywog dolls are appropriate or not, even though gollywog was a derogatory term for people of colour.
Yeah.
Usually the people who have the most to say are the people who are not the people that were called gollywogs, right? So, personally I think that people should just stop making gollywogs. They should just stop making them. But there's always that whole thing in New Zealand of like, no, we've always had them, so we're going to keep having them, And who are you? Well, basically, it's offensive. That's what it is. It's horrible. Like, can you stop? But they don't think like that. Like, I don't know. Like the social media is where they all seem to come out. Like, look at any of this whole thing with the ZB. The ZB host who was doubling down on how we should breed certain people in the community out, right? And she's doubling down on it. Or, the Invercargill mayor.
Yeah.
Not only using the N-word in his speech, but then doubling down in a radio interview. It's like, bro, like, stop. But the people who are not asked about it are the people who are most affected by it, right?
Right.
The people who would be most offended by it are never asked. Like, nobody in media came to any African, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latino, anybody with African heritage or part of that diaspora to ask for their opinion. And that's what I think's like a little bit askew or, a mess with New Zealand social media. It's like they won't go to the corner where they're going to get any resistance from it, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I see that a lot in commentary. Unpacked always does really good commentary on how social media operates in New Zealand, and there's certain things that are just reinforced. I think the covert racism here. I mean, I've always said I actually prefer the overt racism in Australia because you know exactly where you stand and you know exactly who you're dealing with.
Yeah.
But in New Zealand, you don't know.
Yeah.
And so you never know.
As an academic and researcher, partly that's why I do love social media and what happens on there. And again, not in a sadistic way, but to say too that often I can be that way as well because I'm neurodivergent. So it's hard for me sometimes to like determine what people's intentions are. Like, it's better if they just tell me than me trying to infer, because I have so much going on in my mind. I'm going to not probably get it correct for how you think or what you feel. And what I've noticed around, and what everyone has commented on, is that there is this public performance of consent. You know, organizations do it, and we're told, and you know, we all have language and how we navigate. But then there's either unconscious or just what we know is, again, private. And we still hold those beliefs, we still hold those practices. And what, you know, Liya is saying, and some of the others, in terms of even this, the business person, is that it does show up. You know, people challenging that, people coming out with the truth about how they actually feel about people, what they really feel about women, and all this. Now that I have to ask you permission, or you know, I can take you on a date, and that doesn't give me the right to like a kiss or a fondle or something. I hate this stuff and this new culture, these new people, these new definitions. And you know, as an American, that's one of the reasons I left America. When I saw that. Again, we could cancel people and have huge week-long discussions about Kanye or, you know, what some other black person, or we can still talk about Emmett Till and what happened to him. And then we can vote in a president, you know, Donald Trump. That we have the audio footage of, and that told me something.
I tell you what, the Simpsons, was it Simpsons?
Yeah, the Simpsons.
How did the Simpsons get it right? Predicted.
And that's the thing too.
Society long enough, you know how much they just talk and never actually act.
And if you see, that's why I love, and we need to, you know, protect our artists and, you know, our comics, in terms of those people are often observers to culture. So no, they're not mad. Well, again, they might be connected to some magical thing, but often what they're doing is just making observations and then figuring out a way to make it digestible for you to like actually laugh at something. You're like, wow, like that makes sense to me. I've seen that or heard that. So yes, The Simpsons is, and South Park. You know, we say, oh, well, they predicted the future. No. They were actually observing what was happening in the past and saying, okay, this is the logical conclusion of where it ends out. And look at where we are now.
What's that saying? You can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results, right?
That's insanity.
Yeah.
I know, I saw this phrase that said, what is this? If you ever want to see the what the black community is going through, just listen to their music. Just see what the artists are putting out. You're gonna see their intelligence level. You're gonna see what we're thinking about and what our day-to-day life is from those songs. And obviously it gets over-exaggerated for, you know, audience purposes, but still there is truth behind those raps, and there is truth behind, you know, hip-hop, and even Amapiano, to say the truth.
Okay, we're coming up to the hour. I want to thank all of you guys for coming in today. I think we need to continue this, We need to continue this conversation. Expand it out a little bit more into some other things. My thing is going to start blinking in any minute, and it's going to go beep, 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 and the music's going to come on. So I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming in. And yeah, let's continue this. Maybe we can just do an extension on an extension, you know, every week. Save me a lot of work, guys. You know, like I'm exhausted.
I got you.
So we'll see you on the Blackhouse.
Enjoy your weekend.
Next week.